So Karen, I've been looking forward to this conversation since we chatted about it, about the idea of rehabituating ourselves. But the starting point for this one is one that we've been chatting about, you and I, about how I awaken each day with what I've been known to call anxiety. That most of my days start that way. I didn't used to be aware of it, and basically it's an anxiety about facing the day. I sometimes have a fairly daunting schedule with a fair amount of what I call high wire work with clients and so forth. And quite often, the first thing in the morning I wake up to is a sort of a deep breath that says, "Ooh, I got a lot ahead of me today." And you had proposed, perhaps as a starting place for our conversation on this, you'd asked me the question when we talked about this, about whether or not it's actually anxiety or whether or not it's excitement, because I love the work I do. And so that kind of got us started about this whole idea of, the habituated thought or the habituated pattern. Is that an accurate characterization of what we've been queuing up for this conversation?
I think it is, Ron, and I think a lot of people especially wake up in a habituated kind of state. I've worked with a lot of people who wake up with anxiety because it's a busy day ahead, and in those times we are in our most habitual state because we're coming out of that subconscious sleep state and starting to reconnect with our conscious state, and so all the defenses are down, and I think we are in kind of automatic mode. So I think that's a great example of where we are in our kind of habitual or standard state.
Yeah, now you used a metaphor, not just now, but in a previous conversation we had that is actually, it's a really helpful, analogy, I guess, is more appropriate. You talked about the habituated pattern being like a groove in the brain. Right, that we've got this neurological track laid down, that we've been down it so often that it's not like I wake up in the morning and say to myself, I think I'll have some anxiety. What actually happens is I readily find my way into an old groove. I'm almost 56 years old now, so for half a century, that sounds like a long time. For half a century, more or less, I've been playing to this groove. Although, as we talk, I'll acknowledge some progress. But the idea of the groove and what it takes to find a new groove or a new habit. So it might be helpful for our listeners to hear a little bit about that neurological phenomenon, which we've sort of summarized as the groove.
The groove, yes, getting in the groove. Well, and I think with the new advances in neuroscience and being able to watch the brain in action, we're learning so much more about it. And many, many years ago, it was thought that the brain structures were static once we achieved adulthood, which was a really disheartening thought that, once you're an adult, that's it. Your brain doesn't change. But what we're learning is that your brain is changing all the time. At the rate, one of the statistics I've heard is at the rate of 1 million connections per second. So as people are listening to us talk, as we're interacting here, our brains are changing every moment. Unfortunately, most of us, because of our perceptual filters about the world, most of us keep updating our brains in the same old patterns day after day after day. Mm-hmm. It's one of the other statistics that I've heard is about 95% of our thoughts each day are subconscious or are the thoughts that we've had the day before and the day before that. So we are habitual creatures. And it's how if we didn't, we couldn't operate in such a complex world. if we had to consciously think about picking up our car keys and where do I insert the key? What's the key for? If we had to figure it out every day, we couldn't function. So those habits and those habitual patterns help us function in the world. But kind of the question that came up when we were talking about your situation is, are your habits or habitual patterns and thoughts serving you or not? Do you even know what they are so you can know what you might potentially change? And I think most of us are totally unaware of all those patterns that we really could control should we pay attention, observe them, and choose to change them.
That's exactly. I mean, one of the things that I observed is that I'm pretty sure I've had this, let's call it my performance anxiety. It's important to label things. Maybe not label me, but label things. My suspicion is it's been around pretty much my whole life, but it was only, I was trying to think back, maybe 2004, 2005, when I suddenly became aware, to use your word, aware that this thing was tracking on me, because I started waking up in the morning and realizing it was there. I did not know it had been there, presume it always was, but so the starting point was just even, as you just said, just knowing that I had this habit. Although I wouldn't have called it a habit at the time. So the starting point was even becoming aware that I've got this groove that maybe, well, to the degree that it produces true anxiety, is probably not helpful. Mm-hmm. If, in fact, it's producing, I'm going to use a different word, if, in fact, I can use it to produce anticipation for the day or excitement for the day, that's a whole different proposition than what would otherwise perhaps be the burden of anxiety, because anxiety, floods the system with chemicals, and that's probably not helpful in the long run. Does that make sense?
It does. And so what would be the distinction for you? Because our listeners probably recognize they have some anxiety that they would like to transform into anticipation or excitement. So with using you as an example, what would that distinction be?
Well, now let's talk reframing and regrooving, at least as I understand it. Okay, so you start with just being aware, and for me, it was a starting point of realizing that I pretty much awoke every day that way, and I could feel the charge, the chemical charge that came with it. And so I think, to be honest, my starting point, once I got to awareness, was begin to, as we know, this is like such a classic technique, I began to write about it, like daily, well, almost daily. I began to write about it to flush it up out of unconsciousness into my awareness of, okay, what was I waking up worrying about? What were the demands of the day? Where was I having difficulty? And so the first step was just simply getting it out there so I could see it. Probably, to be honest, the next step was working with my longtime mentor in what I'm betting was ultimately a reframing conversation, where we began to bring these things up and ask questions like, well, with regard to this deal that you're facing, this client activity you're facing, is there really any cause for being fearful? Is there any cause for being concerned? Are you adequately prepared? So it's almost like, I don't know, what it reminds me of is kind of like a reteaching to create some potential for something new. Is that the kind of thing you were thinking about?
Well, along those lines, yes. And when you were talking about reteaching, the word that popped into my mind was creating a new perspective.
Oh, that's great.
So the first step was to notice, to create that awareness. The second step was choosing to examine it, say, what's this really about? And then the third step was to get a new perspective about it. And I guess the step that I was thinking about, which now might be the fourth step in this process, is if we go back to just the way the brain works, the science of it, we can't turn off neural connections. We can't say, "Ooh, I don't like that association. Let's unplug that." Boy, do I wish.
Yeah, well, that would make personal change, growth, and development really easy, wouldn't it?
Oh, it'd be great. Hey, I don't want to eat chocolate anymore. Just unplug that.
That's right. I'm going to lose 40 pounds. It's going to happen.
So we can't undo those connections. All we can do is stop using those connections to the best of our ability and replace them with new intentional connections. So anybody who has stopped smoking or stopped eating a trigger food or stop drinking has had to not just say, I choose not to do that anymore, but to replace those patterns of thinking and behaving and feeling in order to really make the change happen. We've got to change all of that. If we don't change the pattern of thinking and behaving, obviously, we can't change the pattern.
Right.
So that's why I was asking if you could say, I would rather, you could fight the anxiety, or you could say, what's a pattern right there in that moment that I would rather be running? Mm-hmm. And let me do my best to shift from anxiety, because the more we focus on the anxiety, the more we deepen it in our brains. So we want to stop that pattern, and we want to change to a more supportive pattern. And so that's why I was asking, what would be the distinction to anticipation or excitement? Because then you can begin rehearsing that. You can make that the new habit of going from anxiety. Oh, I choose not to feel that. Let me shift to excitement.
Well, I'll actually use this actual morning. I was particularly aware of a number of things on my schedule for today. And so I was particularly aware of this morning as soon as I woke up. And what I think I actually did was what you're proposing. It starts with acknowledging that it's there, because, of course, if we don't even acknowledge it's there, as Sam, my mentor, would say, well, there's no solution if you don't know there's a quote-unquote problem. So it's the acknowledgement, and then it's okay. Let's get underway. And literally, I went and took a walk, and I think what literally happened is what you just described. Is I began to examine my day, and somewhere within less than a quarter of a mile, what I was aware of was let's call it a welling up of. I hate to say joy, but that's probably the honest truth. Sort of a celebratory feeling about what's going to be a really cool day. And so it may very well be that the steady rhythm of walking and the within my mind walking through the reframe to put it in a different context to gain a different perspective may have been exactly what you're describing. Although I'm not sure I was as overtly conscious of it as we are right now in talking about it.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I heard in that was what you're choosing to focus on and the language you're using to describe it. Mm-hmm. So you were thinking specifically about the day. And maybe that's where that perspective comes in, is you could have the perspective of, oh, there are all these challenging things that I have going on, or I could really screw up today. I've got some big things going on, and oh my goodness, it could be a disaster.
Yeah.
But instead, I heard in your description, you chose to focus on the more positive elements of it,
right.
and to use language that allowed you to amplify that experience and to feel joy in place of that anxiety. And joy is a high emotion,
right.
Or a high energy emotion too. So both anxiety and joy are higher energy.
Well, and you picked up on it. Our listeners would not have. We were kicking some stuff around before we got into this actual conversation here, but you picked up on the tone in my voice. You I don't remember the language you used, but I remember my response when you poked at it, and my response was, "Oh yeah, I love this work." And so the truth of the matter is that there's a very fine line. Ultimately between the old groove, which would be potentially debilitating anxiety, versus a newer groove that's being established, a rehabituation, which is one of if not anticipation, then maybe as much as truly loving what's coming at me. Which can produce, I can even feel it in my body now, a sense of, as I describe it, a sense of both excitement and pleasure. So I mean that sounds like the creation of a new groove in my neurological patterns.
And the way to amplify that groove that I just heard in that moment was when you used the language, loving what's coming at me.
Yep.
There was some energy in that. And so we can rehearse the groove by rehearsing the language, by rehearsing the focus.
That makes perfectly good sense.
Yeah, because language is always available.
Oh, well, yeah, now that's that, what is it, NeuroLinguistic Programming. Our words signal what's going on in our brain. So we have to flush out a piece of mischief here, though. And the mischief, which is a great word to describe it, is this idea that we should be able to produce an instantaneous new groove, right? Something you and I have talked about a number of times, that there's a lot in the world, in the culture, that says, well, Karen, just change your thoughts, just be different now. And what I'm hearing you say, and my experience tells me, that's not a realistic expectation. Rehabituation is not something that happens overnight, although freely to acknowledge that the new groove can show up seemingly instantaneously. I mean, the literal change of behavior can happen in an instant. But what I'm hearing you say doesn't sound like an overnight, doesn't sound like an expectation that I can regroove or rehabituate myself overnight as a realistic expectation. Is that fair?
It's very fair, and I think that having an expectation like that just sets us up to repeat some of our less than supportive patterns. There's a wonderful book called Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell where he talks about the 10,000 hours that people who seem to be such masters at their craft, if you go back and really study, they have put 10,000 hours of attention and work into that craft. And Gladwell, the author, even presents the theory that it takes that long to do all the neurological wiring that it takes. For example, a chess master has to have practiced all the different possible moves and possibilities before the subconscious can take over and very naturally say, here's the piece that I should move right now. Because the subconscious can figure it out in an instant where the conscious mind can't. So you have to have enough practice that the subconscious can take over, which is what we call habit. And so we have to practice it enough, and we've all had the experience of driving a car or playing an instrument or something like that where we reach that level that we can redirect the conscious mind and actually perform better by letting the subconscious take over. so, yes, and as I mentioned before, we can't unplug those connections, so we have to wait for them to basically die off or reconnect. And the metaphor that I often use is if you've ever seen like you've been at a park and there's a path that it's not a paved path, but people have used that informal path and have worn away the grass, and they call it, might call it a cow path, where the trampling of feet is such that no grass can grow, and it's basically barren. It is so deeply grooved. You were using the words earlier, Ron, grooved, that nothing can grow. And so let's say you put barricades up and you keep people from walking on that particular path. Well, it doesn't recover instantaneously. Mm-hmm. It takes time and weather and nature to reclaim that area. And it's very much like that for our brains. It takes time of not using those connections for them to basically be pruned, the word that neuroscience scientists use is pruned. Let those connections be pruned because the brain wants to be efficient. Mm-hmm. That's its job, to be efficient. And so if you're still using those pathways, the most efficient thing is to leave the connections there. After a while, though, the brain recognizes, hey, we haven't used this in a while, and we'll prune that connection. And in the meantime, you must reinforce the new connections that you want to make. So you're walking back and forth over that new pathway to create the groove or the trench. That's the only way. Now, the other key, though, is the idea of emotion. And so I think when we do see change that does truly seem to happen in an instant, and there hasn't been the previous practice, it's because there was such intense emotion associated to it that the connections happened rapidly. And so Jung called that
the profound psychic change. Carl Jung said that's a profound psychic change. Yep.
And we can do that for ourselves by creating our own emotion as we're practicing the new behaviors. Mm-hmm. So, Ron, each time you wake up in the morning and you shift from anticipation to excitement, and you let that excitement really be a part of you and energize you, that's going to help create the neural connections faster.
So that makes good sense, but the picture that came to mind is bonsai, right? I mean, people look at those beautiful dwarf trees, plants, etc., how carefully crafted they've been. Mm-hmm. And I don't know the length of time, but I remember reading, I was at a garden in North Carolina last year, and there was one dwarf juniper that was just beautiful. And it said that, that the guy had been pruning it for 40 years to get it to that state. Mm-hmm. And so it makes me think that this regrooving or rehabituating should be approached from the standpoint of being an enduring art form, perhaps, as opposed to this idea that we can, instantaneously create enough psychic upheaval in ourselves to have it altered. Maybe that will happen. But it seems to me that rehabituation lends itself to a slow, as one friend says, I wish you a slow, steady, and long process, Ron, which seems like a more realistic expectation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And if it's a difficult one, if we make it difficult, then we either won't stick with it or we'll make it longer.
Right.
And so I think, yes, it's good for us to recognize that we have to first create that awareness. We have to understand it rather than judge it. So what you used was journaling about it, and I thought that was beautiful because if there really is a reason for the anxiety, it's important to address that.
Sure.
But if you recognize, hey, it's just a habit and it doesn't serve me, that's beautiful insight then to do the third step that we talked about, which is getting perspective or reframing or creating the focus and attention the direction we do want to go, and then keep staying that course. Keep doing as you've been doing, keep continuing to create the awareness and the understanding of it.
Well, I think this may have been one of our better conversations of all time, Karen. I think this was just spot on. So it gives me a chance to do a little bit of reframing for myself that I'll actually put into practice today and tomorrow. And good summary. Thanks.
Yes. Well, and we wish everyone the long, steady, and successful application of these principles to change something in their lives.